Hello and welcome to my virtual program. My name is Randall Harris. I'm a Library Associate 1 at the Spalding's branch of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. My virtual program is about genealogy in anticipation with the release of the 1950 US Census that's going to be coming out in April of 2022. I wanted to give a background history about the US Census, the role of the Mormon Church, some tips about how to start family research, and some more links, some more resources to consider when doing your family research. And I will be showing you guys a presentation now. Okay, let's start the show. Okay. To start off with, why is genealogy important? Genealogy is important because it allows you to understand how the past impacted your family. You'll gain a new appreciation on the sacrifice that your ancestors in the past made to get to, so you can see where you've gotten to in life. And another reason why I think genealogy is really important is because it allows you to connect with family members, distant family members for connections that have been lost over the decades. For example, after my grandfather passed away, it came to my knowledge that he actually had 8 other siblings that I didn't really know too much about. And from there, I was able to connect with a few cousins on my paternal side. And now I've been invited to several Harris family reunions and get-togethers in Alabama. And it's just really cool that doing genealogy research has allowed me to connect with family members and sort of, even though my grandfather's passed, I can still bridge that gap with his family today. A little bit about the U.S. Census. It's first started in 1790. That was the first official U.S. Census. 1790. Just a little background: the United States was still a very young country. This was a few years after the American Revolution. This is a bit before the War of 1812. So the United States is still a new nation. So with that, the government knew that they had to start taking population census on the population. So they knew where, because it counts representatives, and it just gives you a better idea of what kind of nation you have. Again, it started in 1790, and from about 1790 to about 1870, the U.S. Marshals actually went door to door to take for the questionnaires to do the census. It was the U.S. Marshals' job. But it came to be known over time that it wasn't the most efficient way of taking the census. Sometimes the U.S. Marshals wouldn't actually print or produce schedules to record the questionnaires, so they didn't really get a very, very crisp grasp of the population. And again, this is the 18th and 19th century, so it's a little harder to get to everybody. It was a very rural nation still, very, very rural. Many places that we call states now were actually territories in this day. So what happened was in 1879, March of 1879, the United States government actually began hiring officials, enumerators, professional census takers to go door to door or farm to farm to get a better grasp of what the population of the United States of America was about. And a little bit more about the census, you've probably seen it before. So it usually goes with questions about as to your age, name, race, marital status, several questions about your income. It changes over time. Sometimes they'll just ask you how much you've made in the last year. In some censuses, they'll ask how much you made in the last week. Depends on which decade you're looking at. But again, those are generally the questions that show up in every US Census, or these. One thing I do want to know is a bit of a tragedy in the world of genealogy is that you can get access to the 1790 census all the way up into the 1870 census. You can all the way up to the 1880 census. You can get all of those online. You can actually find them online or in person. And then again in 1900 to about 1940, up until you get the 1950 census, obviously, that comes out here in 2022. The one census that is essentially missing from the records is the 1890 census. This was unfortunately destroyed in a fire in 1921 at the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C., a little bit of ways up here. And this is seen as a tragedy in the genealogy world because only a few records, only a few of the cities were actually survived. The records of some cities survived. Everything else was destroyed and lost forever. There is no backup record of this, and this is seen as a tragedy. And I do have a YouTube video if you want to know a little bit more about that, that you can access here. That's a little bit about the US Census. I'm gonna get a bit more information here. So by 1960, the nation was growing the population, obviously. So a more efficient way of getting numbers and actually getting it done now was doing it via mailing. So the United States government began mailing questionnaires for the census in 1960. And then this was a better way to make things more efficient. And another thing I do want to point out about the US Census and how they're released is that there is a rule called the 72-year rule. It states that the United States government will not release any identifiable information of people until 72 years after after the census is collected. So, for example, the 1940 census, it was not made available to the public until April of 2012, which would have been 72 years after the initial census was collected. And again, with 1950, again, you go 72 years from that point, and that's where you get the April of 2022 release date. There is no reason why it's 72 and not something else like 68 years, but we do know that it is a 72-year rule. And why that number seems a little bit arbitrary, it is done ultimately to make sure that people's identifiable information is not released while they're still alive, or is still alive or still possibly living at that location, because the U.S. Census does list where people live. A little bit more about the 1950 census. Again, this is the one that is releasing. This is a very big, when U.S. censuses are released, it's a very big day for genealogists because, again, it gives them yet another decade to find family members or find out what their family members were doing. For me, for example, the 1950 census is the first census where I should see all four of my grandparents in there. My paternal grandparents were alive by 1940. I only found my paternal grandfather. My paternal grandmother, she's still living, but for some reason I can't find her in the census records there. I'll get a little bit more into why that may be. If you can't find one of your ancestors in the census, I'll get to some of the reasons why that may be the case. A little bit more about the 1950 census. There was 140,000 enumerators that went around the nation getting information on people to get back to the government. Also, the states, Hawaii and Alaska were still considered territories. So there's 48 states. And I do want to show a link to the 1950 census questionnaire for you. So here we go. See if it loads. Here we go. So again, this is the 1950 census. And it sort of asks pretty the standard questions that we already went over. So house number kind of shows where people live, the unit, are you living in a ranch or a house? Again, this is 1950, United States of America was still pretty rural, especially in the South. A lot of people still lived on farms in 1950. Then it has about names. This is where the head of household is listed first, and everybody under that is listed in relation to the head of house. So, for example, gives you right here, daughter, grandson, mother-in-law, et cetera, et cetera. Race, as you can see with some of these racial categories, they are a bit outdated, and obviously this is 1950, so you're gonna see things here that are not what we say anymore, obviously, or shouldn't have said, but again, that's the racial category. Male or female, how old are you in your last birthday? So this gives you the age, marital status, like we said, state, if you were born in a different, which state you were born in, a foreign nation. By this point, there was a lot of immigrants from Western and Eastern Europe that had established themselves in the United States, so it was pertinent to at least list if you were born in a foreign country. Questions about your income, as you can see here, where you're working at, how many hours did you work, what kind of work. So for me, for example, as a Black American whose family is from the South, up until this 1950, pretty much every single one of my family members I've ever found were listed as sharecroppers. They did not take the Great Migration north to places like here, like Washington, D.C. or Philly or D.C. or L.A. That came a little bit later for my people. So this is just a little example of what the questionnaire sort of looked like. Okay, back to the presentation. Okay, and my story, a little bit more specific to why I started doing genealogy, is it really started out with a simple question. That question really revolves around the death of my great grandmother, whom I knew very well. Her name was Verna Lee Rockamore. She passed away at the age of 97 back in 2019. I was at school during this time period, so unfortunately I did not get to go to her funeral. I was living far away from home. Uh, but one thing I noticed is that at her funeral, it was being held in Atlanta, and she was also buried in Atlanta, which sparked a question to me, which is, why was she not buried, by her husband? From all I knew is that my maternal side, they all lived in Cobb County, Georgia, which is right side of Atlanta, but they lived in Cobb County there for many, many, many decades. And I knew of no connection to the actual city of Atlanta from this part of my family. Everybody was buried in Cobb County on this side of the family. So I wondered, why was she not buried by her husband? My great grandfather, never knew him. He passed away when my mother was was very, very young. So he sort of kind of went away in the history of our family. He wasn't really talked about too much. His name was Carsey Rockamore. So it began to spark that question of, why is she not buried by her husband? So I did some research through Ancestry.com, and I figured out that my great grandfather, Carsey Rockamore, he was buried at an old Black American cemetery in Smyrna, Georgia, which again is pictured right here. And this sort of led me down a further path into my genealogy, and I'll tell you why. This church, where this churchyard, or cemetery where he's buried at, is called Mount Zion. It is a very old Black American church built by former slaves, established by former slaves, about 130 years ago. And when me and my mother actually went to this place, to get more information of why she's not buried by him and where his tombstone may be, we came across the first thing I saw, which was very, very cool. It was the very first thing I saw when I got there was the the headstone for my great great grandfather. His name was Carlton Rockamore. He's born in 1883, died in about 1973. He was the second to last person buried at this location. Another thing I noticed about this place is that it was long neglected. Like many Black American cemeteries that are older, many are in bad shape, vegetation overgrown, headstones knocked over, completely neglected, which was a shame because because this is in this time of segregation. You have to remember that this Black cemetery was right across the street from a white cemetery, which was well kept, even though they're about the same age. Ours was in complete disarray, disrepair. So what me and my mother did is we called the city of Smyrna, Georgia, and through some more research and calling the city and the local politicians in Cobb County, we were able to get the city of Smyrna, along with the Historical Society in Smyrna, Georgia, to help clean up the brush, fix the headstones, and they're going to actually be creating a monument in honor of all the Black American lives that were long forgotten at this location. And I even have an article from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which talks about me and my mother, Mia Dotson, about our quest to get this done, that you can go here and if you want to read a little bit more about that. And I also had another family mystery, and it's about the racial identity of my great-great-grandfather. So my great-grandmother, Verna Lee Rockamore, maiden name Griffin, there was always rumors growing up that her father was a Scottish man, a man of mixed racial ethnicity. I knew that from I was 5 years old to now. It was something that I've always kind of had in my back of my mind. So as I'm doing all this research, I thought, why don't I try to actually investigate this a little further? And I did. And I actually did solve the mystery. And I will get to that. I will get to that a little bit later when I start going through the examples of how to research your family members. So this leads us to the role of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is the Mormon Church. They have a very, very big influence on genealogy, not only in America, but across the globe. They are one of the most well-known organizations for genealogy, and there's many reasons why. One reason is the Mormon Church, they have been keeping with genealogical records since about 1894. They're one of the, as I said before, one of the most well-known researchers in this field. The church today has information on approximately 3 billion deceased people worldwide, and it's growing every day, how many records they keep. Um, they they operate with over 4,600 family history centers in nearly 130 nations. So they are a global entity, uh, and they are very good at keeping records. And I can almost guarantee you that if you have an ancestor, they probably have a record for them. A little bit more about the church. You're wondering, okay, why would this quest be something that the church would put so much time and resources into? Straight from the church's resources is that the church believes that families reunite in the afterlife. So, therefore, it is really important for the living to gain as much knowledge about their deceased ancestors as they can to get prepared for the afterlife. So that's essentially the reason why. And they operate the online source that is a really good source, which is called FamilySearch.org. It is a website where you can build your family tree and look up lots of records, and it's free. It's a very good resource that you could potentially look into. Now let's get a little started on sort of the research tips you should take. Getting started in research. First thing you should do, which is an obvious one, which is talk to your family members. If you have elders in your family, talk to them. It was very valuable for me to actually talk to my paternal grandmother and my maternal grandmother. Unfortunately, both of my grandfathers passed away before I started my research. So there's some things that I won't know because I didn't start early enough, which is why it is very important to talk to your elders while they're still here. Because with a lot of stories, if you don't get them now, they're probably not recorded, especially in the Black American experience. If you don't get it straight from them, you'll probably never know mysteries about your family. So definitely talk to them. Another thing you should do is make sure to ask them about personal stories too. Don't just ask them for dates and names and things like that. That's good, but you also want to get some personal family stories about the personalities of certain members of the family. Like my grandmother told me a story about her uncle, and I could see records of him, but she actually told me what kind of man he was and the sort of interesting things and mind blowing things he did in his life. And it's very important to get those stories because there's one thing to see names on pages and they're just names. It's another thing to actually get stories about these people because it makes them feel more real. So I think it's a very important thing to actually get some personal stories, things that you can't get from a death or a marriage record. Another thing which is really important to do, which is obvious, is that you should write it down or record it. Obviously, get their permission to record them if they want to be recorded. If you do want to record, but write it down. Write down everything they say. You don't want to forget any bits of information. They may ramble. They may talk for a while. That's fine. The more the merrier. But you want to make sure you're recording everything, either audio, video if they want, or at least writing it down. So those are the basic things to start off with. Some more tips. If you're looking at the US Census specifically, you may not find them. As I said before, I couldn't find my paternal grandmother or her mother in a few of the census records, and I haven't got to quite the reason why I can't find them specifically. But for you, you may not find them. And one thing to look for is think about the spellings of your ancestors' names. Surnames, the spelling of surnames change all the time. If you're an immigrant, if your people came from Ellis Island and it was changed then, or if it was changed after, if it was pronounced differently. So, for example, my paternal grandfather, his mother's last name was Bastida, which only comes from one of a couple of Black American families. And it's pronounced Bastida, but there's also family we have where they pronounce it Bestida, and that's how it's listed in official records with both spellings. And another example is what I showed you is my great-great-grandfather, his tombstone, Carlton Rockamore. His surname is spelled with a C right here with Rockamore with a C. All of his brothers and sisters, they just spell it with the Q. So when I was trying to find him, I had to make sure I took into account that he spelled his with a C. So that was able to get me to be able to find his name, find him. Also, also understand that when you're looking at certain census records, they may not have been transcribed properly. So if you see a name that may be similar, you may want to actually click on the actual census record and actually view it yourself and study the handwriting. So that is a couple things to keep in mind. And sometimes maybe your ancestor's just not in the record. They could have been in transit. I had that with a few of my ancestors where they like the head of household might have died right around the time the census was being taken. So obviously in these older days, they sent the family to a lot of upheaval. So your family could be in transit. And with the 1950 census, I do know that they are going to start counting people who were off in other countries. Like if they were in the military, they were counted for the first ever time the U.S. Census did count overseas military members. So again, just keep those things in mind. About if you don't find them the first try, don't be discouraged. Just play around with the whatever you're using. If you're using an online service, play around with the spellings of the names. Think about nicknames. Maybe your ancestor went by a nickname in the U.S. Census. You got to understand that when the census takers, enumerators were going around to house, they would ask who was ever around. If if they came to the house and it was your ancestor's father or sister, they may have listed your like great grandmother. They may have said it, told the numerator that her nickname or something. Like, for example, I found my great great grandmother, under the name Maggie instead of Magnolia in a couple of census records, because you go by nicknames. So keep that in mind. And if you still can't find them, be sure to take a look at. I do know that Ancestry.com has a list of has a good record on U.S. directories. So that's it lists addresses for many cities. I mean, I believe they have over 1 billion records in their U.S. Directories database, 1 billion. So if they live in a city of any sort of size, a decent size, they probably have a US directory that was uploaded on Ancestry, and you could probably find them in there. For example, I found one of my great great grandmothers in the US directory in Mobile, Alabama. So it gave an actual address, which is pretty awesome because this is a lady, obviously, I never knew. She passed away many years before I was born. So to actually get an address and be able to Google search the address and see where the house was is a pretty awesome thing. So those are some things to consider. And again, talking about online resources. Now, Prince George's County, I believe still has access to Ancestry through the portal of Discovery portal that you can possibly access. But if you just want to do this research at home, you can also just go to Ancestry.com. It is a paid subscription. If you don't mind subscriptions, you can do that. Again, as I told you, the FamilySearch.org, that is a free resource that you can use. And then there's 2 other sources I want to talk about, which one is the newspapers.com. So newspapers.com and genealogybank.com, these are newspaper archives. So if you're looking for marriage records, obituaries especially, these are some pretty good sources to consider. You can find a wealth of information by looking at obituaries, depending on the city. So for example, I use newspapers.com for my maternal side of my family, because that side of my family has lived in and around the city of Atlanta for the past 130, 140 years. So with that, the AJC, the biggest newspapers in Atlanta, they actually have made all of their records from about 1864 to now all available online, all of their newspaper records online, which is very, really awesome. And from there, I was able to get some obituaries for some family members. And for Black Americans, they actually started keeping pretty good. They actually started having obituaries for Black Americans pretty early on. I found obituary from my 3rd great grandfather from 1928. And with some of them, as you get further in the years, obviously, you'll get more and more information listed. So you're able to verify brothers and sisters listed on obituaries, parents, everything of that nature, death records, all of that stuff. So could be very good. And Genealogy Bank, it sort of covers all the other newspapers that newspapers.com may not cover. So again, if you don't, and those are both paid, but if you really want to get into genealogy, I do say that it can be worth the while. They do have free trials. So you can test them out for a little bit. And then if you don't like them, obviously you don't have to keep paying for them. But these are very, very good resources to use if you want to get into Ancestry or genealogy. Okay, so in-person research. In-person research you can do. So there's local historical societies and obviously local libraries and courthouses that you can go to. So some records, especially with court records, if your family member lived in a rural place, it's probably not. It probably hasn't been uploaded online anywhere. You would probably have to go to that location. Given with the COVID restrictions, you may want to call them ahead of time to see what is available, what can be done about visiting them in person. But if you want to find, if you can't find a marriage record, if you can't find some other record you're looking for, if you're looking for any sort of land records or anything of that nature, um, you can check out the local courthouses or local libraries. Um, Historical societies, they may have already done the research, valuable research that could help you. So it'd be good to maybe contact them first to see if they can direct you in the possible right direction. If not, obviously contact your local library or courthouse. And ask them what you and tell them what you kind of want to find. Be specific, so you're not you're not wasting their time. You're not wasting your time, and they can go ahead and tell you if they have that ready, and they may even have it prepped and ready for you if you do come and see them. But then again, that all depends on each location. You'll have to call them to see them. But for as far as in-person research, these are definitely things to consider if that's something you want to do. So now I'm going to take you to an example on how to locate people on the US Census. So I'm going to use my great-grandmother, Verna Lee Rockamore, as an example in the 1930 census. So let's go here. Let's see. I'm going to go here. I'm trying to access Ancestry library. Let's see. Here we go. So then again, I got through this portal through Prince George's County Memorial's website. So if you go to pgcmls.info and go to Discovery link, you'll find this. And again, you're looking at the records that we see here. So again, this is why you want to do some research before you get started, so you're not just searching aimlessly and wasting your time. I already sort of knew through research that my great-grandmother was born in 1921 in Macon County, Georgia. So that's something already known on top of my head. And I do know that her maiden name was Griffin. So I'm going back to when you do go by the years, when she's about 8 years old. And again, the census, you don't want to do the 1920 census if your ancestors born like 1921 and 1922. They won't be in that one. And you can look them up in the 1940 census as well. But if I want to get maybe the identity of her parents, or so say, or whoever's taking care of her, what you would do is you would go to the earliest that they would show up in, because this is where you might potentially get that next generation, most likely to get that next generation. Okay, so 1930. Again, I know her name was Verna Lee Griffin, maiden name, obviously, 8 years old. And on Ancestry, they have a thing where you can do exact spelling or initials or similar. Again, as I said before about spellings and how things are transcribed in the database or how things were spelled on this by enumerators, you kind of want to go with what sounds like. You don't want to even go with exacts, because I've even seen a copy of my great-grandmother's birth certificate, and even her first name on there is spelled wrong. It's always good to maybe broaden it just a little bit so that you have a little room you don't want to miss your ancestor. You get a little room for error, say the least. Birth year, 1921. And again, with the exact, you don't want to go anything too crazy, like 10 plus years. I mean, again, if she's an 8-year-old girl, and people in this age, they didn't always know how old they were in this time period. As the decades go by, you'll notice that your ancestors' age may differ, because for most of American history, people, that wasn't their main concern, especially Black Americans. They were making it. They were just trying to survive. So they didn't have a birth certificate. The state of Georgia, I know, didn't start keeping with death or birth records until about 1919, and everybody wasn't even recorded in all of those until much later. So it's always good to give yourself a little leeway, understanding that age and birth, these things, birth dates, these things were not always kept up. People were very busy trying to stay alive and make it. So I'm gonna go with about +2 or +5, right? +5. I do know she's born in Georgia. I won't go with a specific location because, let's see. Oops, excuse me. Because on the census, it just asks which state you were born in, as we saw with the 1950 census. Most censuses, they just ask you which state you were born in. They're not going to ask the city, not on the census record. So I get the state of Georgia, where she lived. Again, doing my own research and talking to my grandmother. I do know that she lived in a place called Ideal, Georgia, which is in Macon County. But just to make sure that just because she was born there doesn't mean she lived in that specific town in 1930. So just to make sure that I'm making sure I'm getting the county and making sure that I'm getting the county she's in and maybe not the town. I'm gonna put Macon County, Georgia, as a place she lived in. And obviously, if you know any of this other information, gender, what race they to be listed as, father and mother's birthplace, things like that, you can always put that down if you know anything else. So I'm gonna search. And boom, okay. So as I'm looking at the records, I'm noticing that there's an Nazi Lee, and we know that's not quite it, because again, her name was Verna, not too close. Fairy Lee. I do know that my great grandmother was not 14 in 1930, and so I know not to choose that. 1925, obviously, no. I knew she knows she's about 8 years old. So what gives us that hit? This right here. The years is very close. So boom. And this is how you find your ancestor. Again, by keeping those things in consideration, keeping spelling in consideration, uh, age, spelling. This is how you keep things in perspective. So, and then we see her and her family. So if you haven't done this already by talking to your ancestor, you could do this now if you're just looking. You can call them and see, hey, I just want to verify that this is our ancestor. What were her siblings' name? If your ancestor does, if your living relative does remember. So, for example, my grandmother kind of confirmed a lot of the stuff with me because I asked her, okay, did your mom have an aunt? Did your mom have a sister named Azzy? She said, yeah, that's Azzy Lee. I have a picture of her. They lived in South Georgia. So I'm like, okay, I see an Azzy Lee. Do you know of anybody named Eberly? He's like, yes, Aunt Eberly. We went to her funeral with your aunt in the 1980s. And it's like, oh, okay, I know I got the right family. I read about her parents, Layla and George. So those were parents. And so, yeah, that's what my oldest brother is named George, which is after George Griffin. And so then you know. And then you know essentially you have the right family. So that's sort of like a breakdown of how you can do this right here. Okay. And I'm going to keep this up because I did want to get into my other example of how I figured out that this George Griffin, how his ancestry was in fact a mixed ancestry. But I do want to go through the rest of the slides real quick first. Okay, so genealogy in the media. There is a very famous show, you probably have heard of it. It's called Finding Your Roots. It's hosted by Harvard professor Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. He's probably the most famous genealogist enthusiast on television. He takes famous people, as you know, across all walks of life, athletes, musicians, politicians, artists of any type, architects, and has them and he reveals mysteries about their families to them. Many of the guests don't know too much about their family histories. So he takes them on a journey into finding records about their families. And it's a really awesome show. It's on PBS, and I would highly recommend seeing that. There's another television show called Who Do You Think You Are? It's on NBC. It's another show where it's a little bit more uh, guest driven, as in the guests sort of kind of go to each location themselves with the help of a genealogist or a librarian to find mysteries about their families as well. But both shows are very good. YouTube is also a great source if you want to find anything about genealogy. So there's YouTube channels like this channel where you can get tips on more tips on about your researching your family things. And she dives deep into different things you should consider or try researching your family. And I do have a really awesome video here about the US Census in general, if you wanted to check that out. And to recap, and before the recap, I do want to show you how I found out my great-great-grandfather's ancestry was of mixed heritage. So we'll do what we did with Verna Lee Griffin. Uh, I will go through a census record. I will go to a census record. And in that last census, we didn't stay on it too long, but it did say he's born about 1870. So what I want to do is go back a little bit and see if I can find someone in his household or someone close to him that could be his father, because that's where the story comes from, is that his father was a white man and that he was of mixed ancestry. So I want to go back to 1900 census. I'm going to type in George Griffin. Oops. 1870, 1875, 1880, 1975-ish, just to make sure we get him, Georgia. And if you know your ancestors, especially in this age, people didn't move around too much, not until later, especially for Black Americans or people of African ancestry in America. They didn't start moving to other parts of the nation until about 1910 to 1940, and from 1940 to 1970, that's part of the Great Migration. So anything before that, your ancestors probably lived within the same counties or same region of a state most of their lives if they did not move anywhere. So I want to try to find a George Griffin in 1900. I want to show you what I found by just doing research. And he is actually listed in two censuses. So again, as listed in that earlier census, him and Layla, which is my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother's parents, listed here in Macon County, Georgia, together. But something else is very interesting. He's listed here as well in the household as a servant to a man named John F. Searles. John F. Searles, a white man. Now, what's interesting about this is that he is not listed as a very wealthy man, but he has three quote unquote servants living with him, who are my ancestors, my third great grandmother, Lizzie, my great grandfather, George, and his kids here. And it's very interesting. And he was a prime suspect because this was not a very, now, obviously white people did have servants living in their household in this time period, but not if they were renting their land and had very little very little money themselves. So what I got from this is that this is just what they told the enumerator, is that, okay, these are my servants. And let's go back a little bit. Let's just note too, Lizzie Griffin, note her, because I kind of want to go back to, keep her in mind as I look back in a further census. Again, I want to go back to the 1880 census. Unfortunately, the 1890 census has been destroyed, so I can't go there to get the records that I need. Let's go back to the 1880 census. So my great-great-grandfather, George, would have been about 3 or 4 years old. Most of the records show he's born about 1876. So let's just type in George Griffin and see what we find. And, oh, Macon County. See if we can find a George Griffin in it. And boom, one George Griffin in all of Macon County, Georgia. Age makes sense. Now look at this. See, in the other two censuses, that I showed you, George is listed as Black. But in this census, when he's 3 years old with his mother, Lizzie, he's listed as mulatto. And this is in the 1800s. So if you're listed as mulatto, you most likely had a very, very recent white ancestor in your family. And the reason why I wanted you to keep note of Lizzie. So this is his mother, my great-great-great-grandmother. No, but notice this though. In that census where she and her kids were listed as servants to John F. Searles, look who is living next door. The US, see, this is a good thing about Ancestry. It lets you view who else is on this page, essentially their neighbors. And guess who is listed right next door? Right next door to them. Frank Searles, John F. Searles. This is him. Living right next door to them. I mean, just it's pretty obvious of where my white ancestry comes from. And that's not even there's even more information that points to this that I will get to as well. So I see those two things. I see them all living together in a household. It's like, I see them again, listed living. I see all them living in the household together. And again, I see them living next door to each other with the children listed as mulatto. Again, these are two very interesting clues. But what I want to do now is go back to the 1870 census. I want to see where Lizzie possibly was doing in 1870. So here we go. Here we go, the 1870 census. So Lizzie or Elizabeth, again, I've done this research a little bit already, so I sort of know where to go. 1870, I want to see what she's doing. See if I can find her. And I'll use the other counties too, just to make sure I'm hitting. And see if I can find her. And I see her right here. Again, she's the only Elizabeth living in this area. She's the only Lizzie or Elizabeth Griffin who's born in this time range living in this area. And guess who she's living with? John F. Searles. So let's take this back. Let's start here in 1870. So in 1870, she's living with John F. Searles uh, as a farm laborer. And then in the 1880 census, she's living next door to John F. Searles with three mulatto children, one including my second great grandfather, George Griffin. The story I heard about my entire life about him being mixed ancestry. It's very fascinating thing. And another good thing that they about Ancestry is they'll give you suggested records too. But I would say this is a shortcut. It is helpful, but it's not always going to give you the proper records. So don't just click on these and assume that they're all correct. You need to actually investigate them and see if they're correct, or if they're correct as can be before assuming that they are your ancestors. Um, so that's a really it's sort of like you think that would be like the smoking gun, as this man John F. Searles is my third great grandfather, my direct white ancestor. That's not even the most solid of the smoking gun. This actual smoking gun, I won't show it here because it would be on my personal account. But through Ancestry.com, you can get a DNA. You can do DNA where you send in your sample, your spit sample to Ancestry, and they will give you like your genetic makeup, racial makeup, and everything of that nature, and your DNA matches. So that will be family members, relatives, and it's very, very useful. And I would highly recommend using it. Um, what the smoking gun was for me is that I actually matched with several ancestors of John F. Searle, like several of his cousins. Through looking at their trees and asking them, I matched with them through DNA. Several of his ancestors, at least 6 of them. So that was the a smoking gun that kind of proved the whole family story as well, amongst all the other things I heard. And even after I got this information, it's hilarious enough, I even got more verified information from my great great aunt, Maddie, who's still living. She's 98 years old. She actually told me she knew George Griffin and that he told her and everybody on the farm that his father was a white man named John F. Searles. So again, that's just an awesome revelation to actually get a family story that was actually true. You always hear about family myths, but ours is actually true. And a little bit more about John F. Searles is that he was a sergeant in the Confederate Army. He served with General Lee. Even though he's from Georgia, he did tag along with General Lee towards the end of the war as they were losing, and he actually was there. Based on his pension records, he said he did surrender at Appomattox courthouse. So again, a direct ancestor of mine, being a part of American history. So that's just a story I did want to share with you guys. It's a very fascinating story, and this is just an example of something really, really interesting that you can get by starting your research. Okay, so we're done there. So back to the slideshow. I believe that is everything. Okay. Yep, that's everything. So we went over the US Census, the history of the Mormon Church and their role in genealogy, some tips you should consider, and I gave some examples, how to do some research, my story, the reasons why I love genealogy now, and some resources to consider. Um, I would like to thank you guys for watching my virtual program. I hope that you take a look at some family history in your past and start doing research because you never know what you'll see or who you'll connect with. And it's a very good way of understanding your place in this country and understanding your family's history. Thank you for joining me. Take care.